This week, of course, as I mentioned earlier in the service, we've got the Passover readings. So today is day 7 of Passover. So these are the day 7 readings. So they're the traditional readings. As you can see here, obviously there's no New Testament reading in particular because there's no day 7 New Testament reading in Jewish liturgy. But I will be having some Brit Hadashah readings throughout the discussion today. But I've called it the Angel of the Lord because we read today the story of the splitting of the sea, the final escape from the Egyptians, and I think there's a very interesting theme which we can really talk about today, which will teach us a lot about God and about how He saves and how He interacts with us. So that's what I'd like to focus on today. So basically, as I mentioned, there's readings for each day. The whole festival, of course, commemorates the salvation God worked for the ancestors of the Israelites. He rescued them from slavery under ancient Egypt some over 3,500 years ago. And today's portion is the splitting of the sea. So as you guys may know, so one of the main commandments of the Passover is actually probably the main one really, is to retell the story of the Exodus year after year. And retell it in such a way that it actually feels current. So so when the fathers of the Israelite sons were to tell their children, they were supposed to tell them what God did for me. So not what God did for our fathers, what God did for me. So it's supposed to be like it's happening all the time. It's refreshed and renewed every year, and that's very similar to amazing. It's amazing the similarities and the parallels between this salvation and also the salvation that we have for Yeshua, because it's not like He saved us when we were baptized. He saves us all the time, and it's renewed all the time. So that's very, very interesting, I think, as a parallel. There's so many more parallels which we can talk about as well. And note the splitting of the sea. I didn't say the Red Sea. So it's in the Hebrew, it's not the Red Sea. The Red Sea is a mistranslation. Yam Suf, which is the Hebrew for the sea that was split, is the Sea of Reeds. And there's a lot of debate as to what that sea was. Most people think it was a sea like a smaller sea or a river that existed sort of further west that may have dried up since then. But again, so it's not the Red Sea that you see in the map, so that's different. So just to point that out. Again, to the discussion about, so many things we could discuss today. I mean, it's such a meaty topic. Like, if you really wanted to tell every single detail that you could possibly do with the Exodus, you could probably spend, 200-300 hours you could be talking about. But we have 20 minutes, so I won't be doing that. But it's useful, I think, just to point out what, interesting other topics for reading if you wanted to. That's an interesting topic as well. All right. So let us actually read part of it. So it's quite small on the screen, I'm sorry, but I'll read it for us. We're reading this part from Exodus 14, verses 15 to 31. The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen." Then the angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was a cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night. I think I'm up to the next slide. Yes. I lost my spot, sorry about that. Yeah, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots and his horsemen. And in the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and of cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and upon their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen. Of all the hosts of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. I just want to say, first of all, hallelujah. That's like an amazing story of salvation, really. So I think we should all, first of all, be grateful and awestruck by the amazing power and that God showed through his salvation to the Israelites in that day. So I don't often say this through the service here, but hallelujah. So I think this counts. So that's a really, really amazing story. I added, I think I underlined it. Did I underline it? Yeah, I did. The angel of God, the angel of the Lord. So this is sort of, there's so many different topics we could draw on and talk about today, but I wanted to really talk about, because this is something that actually, the study of this particular aspect of God actually led me to accept Yeshua, part of the intellectual journey. So I wanted to share a little bit about it today. So the angel of God, or in Hebrew, Malach Elohim, in verse 19, he had a key role to play. So first of all, he was the day-to-day guide. So he was personified in the cloud and in the fire. So the cloud by day, of course, and the fire by night. Very practical. And then, of course, for protection, to guide them, etc. And then in this chapter, he actually became their protector. So you noted that he actually was part of the reason the chariots were so slow, because he actually threw them into a panic. He kept Israel safe from the Egyptians as well. So it was also a protector. What's very interesting is we actually, if we go backwards a chapter into chapter 13 of Exodus, verse 21, God himself is actually mentioned. So it says, the Yud-Hey, Vav-Hey, the tetragrammaton, it says that he is in the cloud or in the fire. But then in Exodus 13 it says God. In Exodus 14 it says the angel of God, which is interesting. So, it's again, this is a very useful springboard into the wider discussion as to who is the angel of the Lord and why was it substituted as well. So I think this is a very useful question, especially when we're talking about the Messianic prophecies, but also just the way, understanding how God reveals himself to us as well. And I'm going to be sort of springboarding from a traditional Jewish point of view at the start, and then we'll be sort of progressing through the Messianic view as well. So I want to give credit where it's due. So the rabbis of old, the traditional rabbis, had a lot to say about this, and lots of divergent opinions. I'm going to just summarize a few of them. So there's many, many more, but there's only a few of them here. So according to some commentators, I've got here Rashi and Ramban. I've talked about them before, so I won't reintroduce them. But basically, what they think is the angel of the Lord phrase is not a literal being, according to them, but they say it's to teach us about aspects of God or his attributes. According to Rashi, it was to teach us about judgment, and according to the Ramban, it was to teach us about justice. And it might seem a bit like out of thin air if we're just reading the plain meaning of the text, but actually those particular conclusions are not actually coming out of nothing. They're actually the end result of a quite interesting exegesis. So again, another very interesting topic in its own right, which I will touch on very briefly towards the end, but again, can't do it justice today. But just want to mention that there is not actually completely, if you actually do a very interesting exegesis, which they do, you actually can get to those conclusions. So again, credit where it's due to them. There was another one called Chizkuni. So Chizkuni I actually haven't talked about before, and I didn't know much about him until I actually did the research for this. So Chizkuni was Rabbi Hezekiah ben Manoah. So Hezekiah ben Manoah, a bit of a mouthful. So he was a 13th century French rabbi, so early Ashkenazi rabbi. And he says that in Exodus 13 verse 21, we know it was God. And in 14 verse 19, we read more detail about the medium that he used. So basically, he says basically this is a substitute for the presence of God. So another way of saying the presence of God came, and it was a descriptor as to how he would do it. Now, others say it was a specific being. So according to Ibn Ezra, again, someone I've mentioned before, it was the great prince. So the great prince, interesting phrase, isn't it? So according to Jewish tradition, it was actually Michael the angel who was the great prince. And the reason for that is in Daniel 12 verse 1, it says, it describes the great prince who would have charge over the people, and that was in the context Michael. So the relevance of that here, the reason I've mentioned it is because the angel of the Lord here is actually protecting Israel, and Michael is seen as sort of the protector of the Jewish people as well. So again, I wanted to give some context about the traditional interpretations before we move on to the what I think is the more correct interpretation. But it is useful to have some context here. I do think Chizkuni and Ibn Ezra were more true to the plain meaning of the text as opposed to Rashi and the Ramban. But I also do think they both missed the mark in terms of who it actually referred to. I do find the Great Prince commentary from Ibn Ezra quite interesting though, so we'll keep that in mind as well. So, I think to answer both questions, we actually need to ask another question, a very Jewish thing. So we answer questions by asking a question, and I think we'll distill the two questions into one. I've changed the who into what. What was the angel of God, angel of the Lord? And the reason I say that is because that answer will give us who, but also will tell us the nature of that being as well. So, it gives us more information if we can answer this question. So the real question is here, what was the angel of the Lord? If it was even possible to answer. So, who knows, maybe it is possible to answer, but I'm just saying, theoretically, what if it was impossible to answer? We'd be left with a very interesting question which we would spend our whole lives thinking about. But I'm just thinking, all those rabbis who are thinking about this question. Anyway, that's fine. That actually wasn't part of this, actually. I was just thinking about it just now. So I was like, yeah, I was actually thinking about it. That would have been a very interesting question for them without that link of Yeshua. Who was this person? Yeah, or this being, anyway. So, I will mention, Malach ha-Elohim, also Malach, Yud-Hei Vav-Hei, Yahweh. So there are different ways of saying that. So, an important discussion is, what is an angel? We have this idea of this little being, the celestial being with wings, they're flying around with a halo on their head, that's the angel. So, but what is biblically an angel? What is it? So, I think the Hebrew word for it, malach, will teach us what it is. So, the Hebrew word malach means simply messenger. So, it's a being, obviously, that delivers a message. And a few examples from Scripture. In Genesis 19, the angels go to Lot and his family in Sodom to warn them of the destruction of Sodom so they could flee. Another example is the book of Luke, so also for good things. An angel tells Zechariah that he and his wife will have a son, John the Baptist, and of course, as we all know, that an angel comes to visit Miriam as well. So they are deliverers of messages, bad messages, warning messages, good messages, everything in between. So that's one function of an angel. Also related to its function is the word lech. So lech means to go or going, and this symbolizes that angels often have specific missions to carry out on earth on behalf of God. For example, in Acts 5, 17 and 21, there was an angel who actually frees some of the apostles from prison. So of course, frees them so they can go continue preaching the word and preaching the gospel. So it is also important to mention what an angel is not. An angel is not an extension of God's direct presence or his direct power on earth. His direct presence is called the Shekhinah, which is a different category. And so, of course, Chizkuni in the previous commentary here sort of equated the two, but I think scripturally speaking, the Shekhinah encompasses that concept of the presence of God on earth. The Malach is, I think, separate. It should be noted that while an angel gives a message, they're not ultimately responsible for the miracle taking place. For example, going back to the Genesis 19 example of Lot escaping Sodom, the angels were not the one who destroyed the city, it was the Lord who destroyed the city with the whole fire and brimstone sort of scenario. So again, it's important to know what they are, but also what they're not. And I think when we actually know this, we can actually understand what's different about the angel of the Lord as well, because if we didn't have a baseline to compare it to, it wouldn't make much sense. So now that we have this baseline, let's continue. So I'm going to now talk about, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the examples of the angel of the Lord, or also some of the revelations that God gives us in the Tanakh, which are a bit strange, in the sense that from a Jewish perspective, it wouldn't make sense. As in, why would God reveal himself this way? So I want to talk about this. Some of them are also the angel of the Lord, but also some of them are also where the form that God shows us is a corporeal form. So a corporeal form means a bodily, physical form. It doesn't have to be a human body. It can be any physical form. But to Jewish mind, to Jewish sensitivities, those sort of things need interpretation. They need explaining, because especially since maybe last 700-800 years, in Jewish theology, any sort of description of God as somehow revealing himself in a bodily form is very taboo, and I think it's one of the reasons why it's hard for Jewish people to accept a Messiah that came in the flesh, or not Messiah, the Son of God came in the flesh, because it sort of seems like a blasphemous idea. So I want to show from the scriptures that it's actually not a blasphemous idea at all, and that was a very important study for me once upon a time. So I would like to go just through a bit of that today. So my first example I've got here is from Genesis 16, verse 10, and it was a promise to Hagar after she was banished from Abraham's house. So the angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. Of course, he was talking about Ishmael, so basically Ishmael became, according to tradition, the Arabs, and the Arabs are very plentiful, so this obviously came true. It's interesting because angels do not have the power to create things, as we all know that. So, only God can create, and God can promise such a thing. So it's interesting that the angel of the Lord says, I will do this. I will multiply your offspring, whereas, of course, we wouldn't expect an angel to do that from our framework before. Only God can create life from nothing. So that's, again, an interesting paradox, a seeming paradox here. Now, I want to very briefly touch on the whole Genesis 18 to 19 portion. Again, not doing it justice here, but basically, as we know, we have the three. Again, this is one of the parts of the scriptures that really proved this concept to me. We have the three men who visited Abraham, and basically, this is just before God destroyed Sodom. So just before he went to the angels went to Lot in Sodom, and most people will say, obviously, the three angels. However, in Genesis 19, at the very first verse, only 2 angels went to Sodom. So what happened to the third one? So, of course, according to Jewish interpretation, I don't really think there's actually a very good explanation. I won't even go into it. But basically, it's explained away. But according to the Messianic interpretation, which I think is the correct one, that third angel was not an ordinary angel. So it also says in Genesis 18 that God was speaking face to face with Abraham as well. I personally think that, from this interpretation, from the interpretation of the 2 chapters, again, I wish I could read both chapters, but from the interpretation of those 2 chapters, that third angel was actually the angel of the Lord. That's my personal interpretation of that, and I think it's the most consistent with what we know so far. But it is very confusing, and again, I'm not doing the topic justice here. But basically, let's go to verse 25 in chapter 18. Far be it from you to do such a thing, so this is Abraham talking, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. So Abraham's trying to intercede for Sodom. Far be it from you, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And this is interesting. So this is actually one of the portions which basically help link back to Rashi's commentary. So it says here, how he talks about, so this is, in a way, he's actually calling this angel the angel of the Lord, because if you think about it, he's saying, you are the judge of the earth. And remember Rashi, he was saying that, when it says the angel of the Lord, it talks about judgment. So actually, even from a subconscious level, there's actually this link between judgment and the angel of the Lord. So even though it's not a direct, obvious, staring in your face link, if you dig a bit below the surface, there is a link between, it's not an ordinary angel here, so calling him the judge of the earth. Rashi tries to explain this obviously as an attribute discussion, but of course here is quite a physical thing here. And of course Rashi Oh, sorry about that. Am I doing something wrong? No. And of course, Rashi would not be considering a corporeal form. Oh, just thank you. Yeah, thank you. Of course, Rashi would not be considering a corporeal form of God. He would never go there, so he tries to explain it in different ways, and I respect him for that. But I think here, really, when we're digging below the surface, it actually makes more sense if we think about this angel of the Lord is not an ordinary angel. And we are using it here, obviously, to describe the nature of the one it describes, as opposed to just the attributes, which I think is the difference between what the Messianic interpretation is and versus the traditional Jewish one. And I guess it makes sense. Like, it seems like I'm doing apologetics for the rabbis. I'm not. But basically, I think it does make sense from their point of view that a corporeal expression of God is such a blasphemous, terrible idea that it has to be explained away. It makes sense why they would come to their conclusion. So I want to give them that respect. But I do think if we take away that and we sort of look at, this is what my, the person who first discipled me, he said to me, forget what you've been taught through the lens of other people, read it for what you think it means and what it means naturally, what the simple meaning of the text. And I think the simple meaning of the text here is saying, this angel is probably just not an ordinary angel. Let's keep it simple. And let's not try and explain it away. So that was something that I went through, again, 7+ years ago now, but that was very, very important for me. So it's quite personal to study for me. So we'll continue to Exodus 32, verse 20. And it was in the context of Jacob wrestling with a very strange man. As we all know the story, we wrestled with God and survived. So, of course, the verse 20 says, so Jacob called the name of the place Peniel. Peniel literally means the face of God, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. Of course, before that we read about a man, not about God per se. And of course, this man also changed the name from Jacob to Israel. Again, it echoes very similar to what God did for Abraham earlier. So again, not an ordinary man, angel, whatever he was. So Jacob at least thought he saw the presence of God. Now, very interesting, the burning bush. So the burning bush example actually has a lot of very interesting nuggets here. So it's a very well-known story, obviously, but there's so much more than meets the eye. So, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire. So the angel of the Lord, he appeared to him in a flame of fire. It's not as a man this time, but as a fire. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. Obviously, that's a miracle, because bushes would normally die if they were burnt. It also says in verse 5 that Moses had to take off his sandals because the ground was holy. And in verse 6, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. So, of course, Moses thought he was looking at God, not the angel of God. And it's very reminiscent of another related portion in Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 to 15. Of course, this was just before the Jericho battle, and he saw the angel of the Lord. This time, it was a human form with a sword in his hand. And Joshua basically talks to this angel, basically asks, who are you? Are you for us? And he's like, he is the captain of the Lord's host. And then when he heard that, he basically starts worshipping him, bows down, takes off his sandals because the ground was holy. Again, not ordinary angels. You wouldn't worship angels normally, and you wouldn't bow down to them. And think back to Genesis 19. Lot didn't bow down to those angels. Another example, the last one that I'll go through today mainly, is basically in Judges 6, verse 22. And this is Gideon's vision of the angel of the Lord. And basically we know that Gideon was charged to drive back the Midianites, but he was quite a sort of, let's say, shy, timid sort of person, so God wanted to encourage him. And he said, then Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. And Gideon said, alas, O Lord God, for now I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, peace be to you, do not fear, you shall not die. So, why did he have to, of course we know that, the fear of God is so great because obviously if you saw God, you would die. That was the natural order of things. So why was he afraid that he saw an angel, he would die? Why did the angel arouse such fear? Of course, only if he thought he saw the divine presence, he would think that. And similar to what Samson's parents said in Judges 13, verse 21 to 22, they had seen the angel of the Lord and thought they were going to die. Basically because they thought they'd seen God. That's the reason why. Not because they thought they saw a mere angel. So again, there are other examples, but I think that's enough for today. Because there's many more, I feel, but these are the main ones. So, Let's talk about the attributes. So whatever the appearances were, whether they were human, they were fire, whatever they were, let's talk about the attributes that we have seen throughout these examples, but that are normally given to God, but that are given to either a man or an angel. So the power to create from nothing, the power to judge and to decree destruction for sin, to bless and to rename, omnipotent knowledge, making the ground holy, leading the Lord's armies, accepting worship, invoking the fear of death from merely looking upon them, and most importantly, being identified with God himself. That's probably the main one. So this leads to a wider question as to how God reveals himself to mankind. According to most Jewish commentators, like I've said, the idea that God reveals himself in corporeal forms, even as an angel, is blasphemous. That has to be understood. They are very clearly differentiated entities, but the scriptures themselves seem to give evidence that the lines blur at times, and it occurs several times. And so what does this teach us? So there's a couple of there's two main possible interpretations. Some angels were elevated above other angels. That's a possible interpretation, given special privileges and powers. It should be noted that not every utterance of the angel of the Lord describes a godlike attribute. So that's very important as well. Not every discussion of that, is always, a godlike discussion. Sometimes he is clearly distinguished from God. And one example is from Zechariah, actually. Zechariah chapter 1, verses 12 to 13. And it says, "Then the angel of the Lord said, O Lord of hosts, how long will you have no mercy on Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, against which you have been angry these 70 years? And the Lord answered gracious and comforting words to the angel who talked with me." So obviously in this case, if God's answering the angel, then the angel's separate. So again, not every example of the angel of the Lord is as we've discussed. But enough of them have been that way, which leads us to answer a question. And of course, the other, I think, more likely interpretation is God appearing in corporeal form, and it's also called a theophany. So, again, fancy theological terminology, which I'm not very acquainted with, but basically I looked this up before I used it here. So actually, it's the correct, that's what it means. So I made sure because I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of Lawrence and Ashley. But yes. So that's what it's called apparently. God appearing in corporeal form, a theophany. So which I think is probably the most likely meaning of this conundrum. And I think it's the most consistent and simple meaning. So, the idea that God reveals himself in a corporeal form of the theophany, I think can be sort of concluded by studying the context and also studying, the surrounding picture. So basically, I think it's actually quite clear from Scripture. We don't have to rely on commentaries. If we actually look at the context in which each of these utterances actually occur, I think sometimes it can be quite clear that it's not, the angel of God, or sometimes it is the angel of God. I think depending on the attributes that are described, and also the context and identifying with God, etc. So I think we don't need to rely on a very complicated set of rules, I think. Now, to go into more specifics, are the theophanies simply the appearance of the indivisible God in a corporeal form, or is it the appearance of a specific entity within the Godhead? And that's very relevant to us because, of course, we believe at Beit HaMashiach, obviously in the Trinitarian view of God, that basically God exists in, again, theological language. I did look this up before I started talking, so it's not my area of expertise. I'm very much a layperson, so if I get some things mixed up, I'm sorry. But basically, we believe at Beit HaMashiach in the Trinitarian view that basically God exists in three distinct personalities, a part of sort of an overall, revelation of God to mankind as part of the Godhead. So we believe that at Beit HaMashiach, and that's distinct to basically believing that the essence of the Father manifests in different ways. It is distinct. I can't really explain it very well in terminology because I'm not that familiar with it, but maybe Lawrence and Ashley will explain it at a different time. But basically there is a distinction. So it is important to unpack it a bit more. So one actual source that I went to, an ironic source, ironic in this congregation, are the church fathers, actually. So the church fathers had a lot of really bad literature, of course, and Hasidic literature, but they also had some very useful literature too. So I've actually read this commentary from a guy called Theodoret of Cyrus. He was a 5th century theologian from Antioch. So Antioch, of course, was an ancient center of early Christianity. And he actually taught specifically about this portion today in relation to this question, so I wanted to actually share it with us today. Exodus 13 shows that it was God who appeared to Moses, but Moses called him an angel. in order to let us know that it was not God the Father whom he saw, for whose angel could the Father be, but the only begotten Son, the angel of great counsel. So he's basically saying here, if it was really God the Father who was showing himself in his form, he wouldn't have had to refer to himself being an angel, because God doesn't, God has angels that he brings out, but there's no angel above God, in other words. So there's angels above men, which is why he had to say it was an angel. That's essentially what he's saying here. And it's interesting interpretation here. But I don't think it is possible to prove either way by looking at the Tanakh alone. I do think we need to look at Yeshua's own words as well and see how he connects the dots and what he says about himself. So let's go to the Brit Chadashah now. And I want to just highlight a couple of portions. The first one is from John chapter 5, verses 45 to 47. In the rebuke to his brethren, he says, "There is one who accuses you, Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" So what is Yeshua saying here? He's saying here that Moses wrote about him. We believe that Moses penned the Torah, including Exodus from which we read today. Could it be that Moses was writing about Yeshua in the way he understood by using the angel of the Lord terminology? Quite possibly. And I think Yeshua is actually hinting at such a possibility. Another example from Luke 24, verses 44 to 45. Then he said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you." This is Yeshua talking. "That everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. I wish he would do that to us. I wish he would just come down and say, "I will tell you what everything means," and then we don't have to guess. I was like, Lawrence, actually I bet they were jealous of that as well. I want that experience as well. Anyway, so again, Yeshua is testifying that the Torah testifies about him. So if the Torah is testifying about Yeshua, then it's our responsibility. He tells us, he doesn't tell us obviously all the specific meanings, but he does tell us the most important thing, that the Torah testifies about him. And therefore it's our responsibility to look for him in the Torah. So it's not enough just to say, we're not really sure. We do have to make a call, and we have to make a call and understand that the conclusion is that Yeshua is revealed in the Torah, and obviously the prophets and the writings, but specifically in the Torah. So we have to look for him. Now, going back to the question, is the occurrence of the angel of the Lord here an appearance of Yeshua prior to his incarnation or a non-specific theophany? I'll be honest, I'm not sure, 100%. Strictly from the Tanakh, I'm not 100% sure, but the but is a big key here. What we can be sure of is that Yeshua has revealed himself to us through all Scripture. That's what we can be sure of. Whatever the answer is to the question, it still bears witness to him. I don't think the specific answer to this question is actually relevant to the truth of the matter, which is Yeshua reveals himself to us through the Torah. Now, the answer to that question was important to me once upon a time, to accept the possibility of a corporeal expression of God, and therefore to break through the theological framework that, it wasn't idolatry essentially, because of course, according to Judaism's point of view, this is an idolatrous point of view. But to me, that was very important, a very personal study, which made it, I didn't feel guilty about believing in Yeshua. I didn't feel like, I was committing idolatry, I was like being a blasphemer. And to me, that was a very important study. But I think as believers, that specific answer to that question doesn't change the fact that Yeshua revealed himself anyway, if that makes sense. Does it make sense? I hope so. Anyway. Even as a theophany, it shows that God will intervene directly in this world in a corporeal form at times. I think that is quite clear. It shows, despite the disagreements with the classical Jewish commentators, that God has worked in this way. So according to the Jewish scriptures, believing that the Messiah is a divine being existing before the creation of the world is not blasphemy, it is not idolatry, but rather consistent with what we learn throughout Scripture about how God relates to us. And of course, it is fitting that Yeshua the Messiah is the one who fulfills it. And I think that's important for Passover because we're not only understanding his salvation, but also his essence. And I think we can, actually through his salvation, we can understand who God is and also his attributes and of course his, who he actually is. And I think that's really, really important for us today. Like for an example about why this is so important, there are people who will say, let's say the monotheistic religions. They use the monotheistic religions as like a monolithic thing. Everyone's the same. So Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they're all the same because they believe in one God. And the God that all of these religions believe in is the same. So I'll draw a distinction between, obviously, the God of Islam and the God of Judaism, Christianity, because the Judaism, Christianity one's more complicated. But like, for the God of Islam, people will say, I've actually heard this before, actually, especially at university, the God of Islam is the same as God of Christianity and Judaism. Whereas obviously most of us would say here, they're not. And why would we say that? It's because of the attributes that we ascribe to the God. So it's not just about, it's not just, it's one God, his essence is the same, blah, blah, blah. It's also the attributes and how we think about God and how we understand God to have revealed himself to us and how we understand his character. So, and that obviously makes our idea of God and their idea of God very different. And I think that's important, coming back to our discussion today, is we have to understand as much as possible, within our human capabilities, how God has revealed himself to us. And we can do that through understanding, this episode of salvation, and also his salvation at the stake 2,000 years ago as well. So I think that's very important. It's a very personal study to me as well. So I hope you found it very helpful. We'll stop there.